Welcome to the Directing Animation Livecast with Scott Weiser. Now that I'm done directing the development and first episode of the second series of Space Station Animation, I'm joining up with Steamroller Animation to push the boundaries of the art form. Thanks to the support of so many of you, I'm continually developing more than 10 dynamic feature film pitches while mastering the art of telling deeply meaningful stories. Today, our guest is the ultra-talented Chris Sanders. His work includes, at least as a director, Lilo and Stitch, How to Train Your Dragon, The Croods, and then before that, you worked on several different projects at Disney. I know you were a writer on Mulan, and I'm so excited to have you here. You just have a fantastic art style and a unique voice. In all the studios you have worked at, I feel like your projects, the stories have a unique voice to them, and I want to discuss how you get that and, yeah, just dive into all the great things about directing animation.
Thank you so much for having me. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, it is. Is there anything to that intro you'd like to add, or?
That was a great, that's a good intro. I have nothing to add to that.
Awesome. Well, let's dive into that first question. How do you maintain that voice, that unique voice to your projects? You know, in the studio system, it seems like sometimes there's got to be a Disney feel to things, but there was something different about Lilo and Stitch, you know, and then in DreamWorks, they have a certain feel to their movies, and there was a different, unique, I think both to like the Kung Fu Panda series and to the How to Train Your Dragon series, that they seem to stand out in a way. And I'd love to know how you maintain that unique voice in the project.
I would say if there's anything that would be consistent through the stuff that I work on is that I think I come from a place of sincerity. I'm not uncomfortable with the emotional wavelengths of the films that I work on. I would say that I embrace those things, and I think that's where I thrive, is more in those emotional places. I've worked with people, I've worked with executives, and some of them are more focused on, I think, in the case of like Jeffrey Katzenberg, one of the things I really appreciated is that he was always attending to the audacity of a movie.
Oh,
I think
that's cool.
I think in general, he tended to, because as you work on these things, I think you get closer and closer and closer to them until like you might get lost in the details as a director or a writer or a story person. So you can get lost in the details, but Jeffrey would constantly pull you back and force you to look at the big picture.
Yeah.
Well, we worked with an executive named Bill Damashki, and he was much more attentive to the emotional wavelengths. And so between the two of them, I thought they had a great relationship.
That's cool. And the audacity would be just like the boldness of what you're trying to say and the courage to be unique.
And to remind you to think of the audience, to remind you like this is a movie. People paid money to see this. They didn't come to see real life. They came to be taken on an adventure. They came to escape, and they came to feel something. And so do those things.
Yeah. That's awesome. Have you encountered, if you've encountered like resistance to that, the emotional rawness or the audacity of a story, how have you helped people get on board with that?
I've never had anybody that didn't respond to the emotional things that we were doing.
Okay.
I think that we're good. I think that we being, I worked on many of these things with Dean Deblois, and I also worked with Kirk D'Amico on the Croods.
Yeah.
And I've always worked with people who had a similar sensibility.
Okay.
The most important thing in a co-director is that you all share sensibilities, so that one of you is not making a drama while the other one is making a comedy. You don't want to be at cross purposes. That said, though, you want somebody who sees things differently. And so everybody I've ever worked with has brought in a different dimension to the whole process, but we've always been making the same movie. I've never had anybody not respond to the emotional things we put in these things. But I've definitely worked with people who have, how do you say? You can with people. I've worked with people who will give you notes along the lines of like, well, I don't get this, or I don't buy this, I don't buy this, I don't, and there are just leaps that you have to make when you're making a movie. Again, in service to the audacity of it, that if you stop and really logic every single thing out, the whole thing will fall apart. A
Oh
really good
yeah.
example of that, a good example of that would be,
Yeah.
especially in the Croods, you can't write a movie like that without constantly referencing things in the dialogue that are impossible. They would say, "Wait a minute," or "Put on the brakes," or there's all these things they're saying, like they don't have minutes, they don't have
They don't
brakes.
have breaks. Yeah.
But you can't write the movie if you take all those things away. So in a case like that, and in all these cases, you really have to close your eyes and just feel your way through it. Does it bother you? Does it bump for you? Or does it stick out? And
Yeah.
if it does stick out, you have to attend to it. If
Yeah.
it bumps, you have to attend to it. But if it doesn't, then don't stop. Just keep going.
Yeah.
Just right past those things, because you should have, hopefully you have a bigger destination.
Well, that bump phenomenon you mentioned is very interesting because I think sometimes it's almost so far in the back of the mind that you feel like you can ignore it, or that you almost don't hear it. But I think as a creative, you definitely learn to notice it. How would you describe that bumping feeling for yourself?
I think oddly enough, there's two times I notice things like that. Of course, the first, hopefully you notice it right away as
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
just watching this whole thing. Once we get things up on story reels, we will watch them in story reel form. That's the second time you're confronted with it, and now it's taken its first step to being a movie, and that's where a story reel is where you take all the different story drawings, which are just black and white drawings, and you string them together with music and dialogue, and the whole thing, you can build the entire film as a scale model in story form, in story reel form. Now you're watching it more like a movie. That's the
hmm
second time that something that's going to bump is going to make itself evident.
yeah.
Just the nature of seeing it, like now it's being, now it's up on screen. But the last time that you'll notice it is in a test screening.
Ah,
So
yes.
we will test the film before it's finished. And
hmm
then, of course, we'll test it afterwards, and just to get audience reaction, stuff like that. And there's just a phenomenon that occurs when you go into a theater with strangers and you sit down. It's weird how many times you sit down and go, "Oh my gosh, we should have taken this part out."
Yeah,
And suddenly there's this sobering this thing that happens
yeah,
that, like, somebody else is going to see it, and you're like, all of a sudden, even before they watch it, you're like, "I shouldn't have left that in the movie. That was a waste of time. I got to take this out." Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and then of course, now several times we've gone to screenings and we've had the opposite happen, where there was something I was beginning to get a little bit wary of in the story,
Oh, yeah.
feeling like pulling it out, and the audience reacted positively, so we left it in.
Ah, yes. That's really cool. That's really cool. I think it's something about the lens of another person. You know that the other person's going to look at it, and so all of a sudden your
Yeah,
brain runs through it, and it's like, what's wrong with it?
yeah,
I found
yeah.
that with writing. You hand somebody one of these books, and suddenly I know the problems that are there. You know, and luckily
Yeah.
they've gotten less and less over time because I learned to structure that into the process of like, you know, rather than a test screening, I've had a test reading or whatever. But these are pitches for films anyway, so I imagine there'd probably be another level if any one of these got picked up, that you'd get it all in an animatic form, and then suddenly you'd have that process again. You'd be able to
It,
see it through those other eyes.
I remember the I used to well, being a story artist, if
hmm
you're doing a job, you do a certain amount of rewriting, because when you get the pages from the script, they never translate directly. You always have to do some kind of adaptation, large or small. And I would get really frustrated back on Beauty and the Beast, and when I worked on Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin, and even Lion King, I'd get these pages and I'm like, well, these don't work. I need
Uh-huh.
to, and I think, like, someday when I write one of these, I'm not going to have to go through this, right? So fast forward to Lilo and Stitch, and now I'm sitting down with my pages that I wrote,
Right.
and I'm going to board
Yeah.
it. I'm going to board
Uh-huh.
my pages finally. And the first thing I thought was, well, this doesn't work.
Yeah.
What? Who wrote this? Like, this can't possibly work. It's suddenly you're just, and it makes sense. You're not, when you're writing, you're attending to something different. You're not really attending to every single little nut and bolt as to the physics of how somebody moves through a space, or how these different scenes might relate to each other visually as they transition. So you just are naturally going into a different level, where now it's like you really hit the beach.
hmm
Like, storyboarding is where the story really lands. It hits the beach and it's going to start making its way inland,
Yeah.
and you got to fight your way off the beach and get through all the growing pains. And so there's no way you can really foresee everything as you write. So it's natural to reboard some things. So
Yeah.
you're already writing, and so that was really my introduction into the writing part of it, and to dealing and to associating with and dealing with writers.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we have a viewer who asked a question about who are the storytellers, like filmmakers, directors, who inspire you most in the present and in the past?
Oh my gosh.
Where to start?
I can talk about like favorite films, and the funny thing is I don't know exactly like who directed these necessarily, but in the live action realm, certainly To Kill a Mockingbird
Mm.
is really amazing. And one of the things I learned about that, they had the writer on set
Oh,
the
wow.
entire time they filmed.
Wow.
And as they worked on the thing, if there were any sort of changes or revisions, um, uh, she would she would pen them for them. So they kept her very close during that whole thing. And I feel like that is a it's an unusual story. Certainly, um, It's a Wonderful Life. Um,
Ah, yes. That's Frank
all these
Capra. I can definitely tell you that one.
Frank Capra.
Yeah.
Um, I actually stayed in, supposedly, as if the legend is correct, I stayed in this hotel out in Palm Springs where he wrote that movie. Um, uh, yeah, I think movies like that are unusual structurally.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, if you like
uh,
his that film, you'll like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. That one's really great.
yes,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. And I
And
think in the animated realm, um, Charlie Brown Christmas
mm,
is one of those magical things. I think not unlike Lilo and Stitch, that it was obviously a very personal project,
yeah.
and um, and it has its flaws, but if you fix them, it wouldn't work. And that's what really inspires me about that. It inspires me and it kind of terrifies me as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, that makes sense.
I don't like reminding myself how much chance there is in this whole thing.
There's a
There's a lot
ton.
there's a lot you can attend to. There's a lot you have under your control. But
Hmm.
there are other things like that are the happenstance of how these projects fall together. Some of that you can't really control. So some of that is like, oh, the casting and stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I mean, casting behind the scenes of like, which animators will you get, which cinematographers are you going to get?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
absolutely.
and you get a collection. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just
Oh
once you
yeah.
get that collection of people, every single person will contribute. And if you went back in time to Lion King and you changed out even one person, that movie would be just a little tiny bit different, right?
Yeah. That's pretty
So
inspiring to think about.
there's an alchemy to it.
Yeah, there is. There is. I might be able to speak to the Charlie Brown one a little bit because somebody was asking me yesterday what my favorite, because I used to do a lot of musical theater, what my favorite Broadway musical was. And for some reason, You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown keeps rising to the top of my list. And it's really a bunch of vignettes. It's like a car. I think the reason it works is because
Mm,
it's like a cartoon strip where you have all these little moments, but then they come together to this great meaningful whole. And when, Lucy Brown says, oh, it's not Lucy, Sally Brown says at the very end, "You're a good man, Charlie Brown." I just get the most, like, I get goosebumps and the most visceral
mm,
feeling, and I think part of it is the characters and the nature of like Charles Schultz's creation,
mm.
that may be part of the alchemy that we're missing as well.
I think that's a really interesting example that you give, because one of the things about Lilo and Stitch to me
Hmm.
must have been true about that film to him, because he knew those characters better than anyone.
Ah,
And really early on with Lilo and Stitch, Dean and I began to write it. And the first draft um, is not going to be the film. You're going to rewrite it and stuff like that. Anyway, one of our development executives actually approached Dean and I and said, they're considering getting a writer to come on board, because that was
yeah,
not because we weren't doing the job right, but because that was really just the way it was done.
that's
We
what you do.
always
Yeah,
got right. And Dean and I felt like, well, we can write it. We really
yeah.
felt strongly that we wanted to like retain control over this whole thing.
Right.
And one of the reasons I felt very strongly about it was I thought, well, how is he going to write Lilo? He doesn't know her. I do. Like I know what she does. I know what she does and how she does it and why she does it.
And why she does it?
He
Yeah.
won't know that. So I foresaw myself sitting down going, no, no, you're and really not being a good person to work for in that situation, because I think he would just get frustrated with me, because I'd be just like, well, you're doing it all wrong. Um, So Dean and I redoubled our efforts to make sure that the characters were distinct and the writing was up to par. Um, and we remained writers on the whole thing, and we never got a writer. We were the writers.
Yeah,
And
that's
that was
awesome.
also very important to us because back then there was a real sort of push and pull between writers and the story crew,
Hmm.
and there could be animosity. Sometimes they work really well together. A lot of times there was animosity, and because I think the two groups didn't understand each other. And again,
Hmm.
going back to Mulan, I did writing on Mulan. I wrote enough of my scenes as
Yeah.
I went and rewrote some of the scenes because
Hmm.
I thought, well, this doesn't work.
Right.
Like the whole thing where the dad says the thing about the blossom, where
Hmm.
she's had a bad day and he needs to talk to her about it, but neither of them really want to discuss it right out in the open. So instead, he says that whole thing about the flower, which is
Hmm.
something I wrote because I felt that
Wow.
would be a natural way for a guy who may not be comfortable, 100% comfortable in that situation. How would he say it? And
Yeah.
so I wrote that bit. I ended up writing enough of the movie that they granted me a writing credit at the end.
Wow.
And that was something that was completely discretionary. The studio didn't have to do that. So that was my first writing credit, and I really wanted to roll forward with that. That was another reason that Dean and I really wanted to write Lilo and Stitch, and we ended up writing How to Train Your Dragon, the
Yeah.
final version. Um, so making that jump into writing was really important for us. And when you talked about this, kind of brings us full circle to the very beginning when
Yeah.
you're
Yeah. Yeah.
talking about how do you keep your essence in the movie. The more stuff of yourself in there as that you can get. So if you can work yourself into a position where you can write uh, or partner with a writer, you're going to get a lot more in there, I think.
I think so. Absolutely. So that's really cool too. That's not what I expected to hear, which is great. You mentioned Dean Dubois. I think I just pronounced his name wrong, but he's awesome, right? He was mentored by Joe Grant, wasn't he?
Yeah, Joe Grant, and he kind of mentored all of us. He was at the
Yeah.
studio when I was there. Um,
Oh man.
there's a Joe Grant story that preceded my arrival, but I was told of it. Like a bunch of new executives came in and they had this big meeting, and all the executives went around the table and they said, "Well, introduce yourself and tell us what projects you started with and stuff." And as they went around the table, they were like, "Oh, they were very relatively young." And when they got to Joe Grant, he said, "I'm Joe Grant. My first movie was Snow White."
Yeah.
That that was a moment.
That is an amazing moment. And he
One
had
of
the
the things I
coolest
love,
job too. He could just walk around and give people story ideas, and just
yeah,
influence the projects and give them unique gifts. He was like a gift giver. He'd just walk around, which is actually what storytelling should be. We shouldn't be making these things to show off or to show how amazing we are. They should be gifts, that we're
yeah.
giving to the audience, like you said before. Yeah.
I met Joe on Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
When he would drop into the story meetings, and that
Hmm.
was when I first met him. And I knew him ever since.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember one time he dropped into my office, and he was really excited because he said, "Oh my gosh, you have ink!" Because I had ink bottles on the desk.
Yeah.
Joe loved to he really liked to work with pen and ink.
Yeah.
So when he saw ink on my desk, he's like, "Oh my gosh, nobody has ink anymore. This is great." And we spent a whole afternoon talking about just like pens and ink and brushes. It was great.
Oh, that's amazing. That's so fun. Yeah, he's really inspirational. Are there any other lessons that you picked up from him that you feel are very valuable?
Oh my gosh, he and Bertie Madsen. One of the things, actually, here's I. One of my great regrets with Joe is that one day he brought in a photograph and he showed me this photograph, and there were these chairs at Disney Studio. They became kind of legendary. A designer, I can't remember the name of the designer, but they were designed specifically, I believe, for Disney Studios. Those chairs, and we just had them in our rooms. And if you got an office with one of these chairs, they kind of reclined. They were made of leather and bent
Yeah.
wood, and they're
Nice.
beautiful. They're like sort of 1930s kind of a vibe.
Ooh.
And they became very sought after at a certain point. And at a certain point, they all disappeared from animation, and I think they all went across to the executive offices. Um, but Jill brought in a beautiful photograph of someone. It was black and white, and it was somebody sitting in one of those chairs, and the sunlight was coming in from the side, and I can't remember who the subject of the photograph was, And I said, "Oh my gosh, this is a beautiful photograph." Because we'd been talking about film and cameras, and he said he had a Rolleiflex and he used to take pictures of the studio. And this was a photograph from inside Disney Studios during Joe Grant's era. And
Mm-hmm.
and it was so beautiful. And I said, "Oh my gosh, did you take a lot of photographs at work?" And he said, "Oh yeah." He said, "I took a ton." And I was like, "Oh my gosh." Sitting in his, house in some photo album is a treasure trove of photographs from the studio during its golden era, its silver era, whatever, its platinum era, that nobody's ever seen, that maybe only Joe has seen.
Wow.
And I thought, oh my gosh. And I tried to persuade him to, like, if you bring in the negatives, I'd scan them right here. We could scan them, so maybe like we could digitize them so other people could see them.
Oh,
And he was a little bit reticent to do that, which I get.
yeah.
But I've always wondered what else he had pictures of from the studio.
Wow, that'd be fascinating.
Yeah, from that era. Can you imagine?
Yeah,
Oh,
that'd be amazing. So we've talked about Lilo and Stitch. We've talked about the Croods. We haven't really talked too much about How to Train Your Dragon, which, yeah, when I mentioned you being on the show to many people, they were really excited about that project in particular. Um, what would you think was the biggest lesson that you learned during How to Train Your Dragon? It doesn't even have to be lesson; it could be lessons. But
yeah, that was a huge one. Okay, so I was asked to come in on that after it had been in production for, I'd say, a year, maybe a little bit more.
mm-hmm.
So they were down the road and they said, "Will you come in and take a look at the film? Because we're interested in you taking over the directing of it. We want to make some changes." And I had seen it in the halls, but I didn't know anything about the story or the book or something like that. So he said, "We're going to give you the story reel, and then we're going to give you the book, and you can take them away for the weekend, take a look at it, and see if you want to do it."
Oh,
So I read the book for the very first time, and then immediately sat down and watched the story reel, and it was immediately obvious to me that there was a short circuit, that with
interesting.
it had been built into the book and they were dealing with it in the story reel.
Oh,
Something
yes.
that something that we had to change or the film
Mm.
would work.
Mm-hmm.
So my first call was to Dean, because they said, "Oh my gosh, what are you doing right now?" Because I just landed on this project and it's the perfect one for both of us to partner on again. And
Yeah.
he said, "I was finishing something up." So the answer is yes. Um, and here's the short circuit in the book and in the story reel. Um, their Vikings collect dragon eggs, but they also fight dragons and
Oh,
battle. And so there's conflicting things. So the question is, are Vikings treating dragons like kind of like horses, like
pets.
wild
Yeah.
horses? Do they collect them and train them and stuff like this, or are they enemies?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was where the whole thing started. So and Jeffrey Katzenberg sat down with Dean and I, and he said, "Normal, as you know, we normally make these films 3 times. You only have enough time to make it once. Get it right." So what we did was, and so we this taught me a lesson.
Yeah.
It is okay to treat a film mechanically and look at it just clinically and structurally, because it doesn't mean that there's going to be no art. It doesn't mean the film will have no soul. Dean and I had to look at this film like almost like a math problem or a
Uh-huh.
structural problem. So we stepped back and said, "Okay, is this?" So we got a blackboard. We got a good old fashioned blackboard that we hung up in the room that we would write on with chalk.
Yeah.
And once every day or 2 days, we would have a meeting with Jeffrey, and we would make a decision. And once we made that decision, that was done. We moved to the next step. We never second guessed ourselves. So basically the very first thing that we pitched him was, do Vikings partner with dragons and ride them like horses, or are they at war?
Mm-hmm.
We were recommending they were at war. That's going to be the biggest energy source for the film. And Jeffrey said, "Great, they're at war, done, boom." So then we would move to the next thing. Okay, if they are at war, then what's the things we have to look at next? And for about 2 weeks, we intensively went through the film at a structural level, made decisions, and we stuck with them. And one of the things that we had to pitch that they embraced is we had to change Toothless. The Toothless from the book is not the Toothless in the movie.
Oh,
They are very different. The
okay.
Toothless from the book had been built by the studio at great cost. He was detailed and beautifully rigged, and they had tested him and animated him, and he was the wrong dragon. This dragon was only about 3 feet long. The book, the Toothless from the book is a little tiny dragon that sits on
Interesting.
shoulder.
Yeah.
And that's all the bigger he ever gets. He's still in the film. There's a scene where Toothless lands on a beach with Hiccup, and they're enjoying some fish, and all these little dragons land and bother them. They're almost like seagulls. Those are the original Toothless.
Oh wow, interesting.
That dragon is more expensive and more fully rigged almost than Toothless is, because that was the original Toothless.
That's incredible.
So you can see the problem. If that dragon, if he's going to befriend a dragon, if they're at war and he befriends a dragon, that dragon has to be the most terrifying dragon of all, not a little tiny dragon that needs to be protected. Like him hiding this little tiny dragon from his dad, like in baskets, and hiding him under his bed and stuff like that. That's not a movie. We need him to befriend the enemy. So we went back to the studio and pitched that to Jeffrey, and he said, "Do it. Make him the most badass dragon you can imagine." Right?
Yeah.
One of the things that Dean and I were doing while we were having him built. So we came back and said, we want the sports car of dragons. We want him to be actually smaller than the other dragons, because some of these dragons are huge.
Yeah.
And you might think immediately, like, oh, okay, if he's going to be the most badass dragon, he's going to be this massive dragon. And we were like, no, he's going to be like a sports car. He's going to be like a Corvette. He's going to be like a fighter jet. He's going to be more compact. He's going to have tighter wing structure. He's not going to have these giant wings that have like tears and rips and stuff. He's going to look durable, right? And as we were redesigning him, the next thing that happened was we had to figure out what color he was going to be. And one of the engineers, or was it one of the engineers or artists, as a screensaver, had a Black Panther. And Dean and I took one look at that, and we were like, that's what he should look like. And we knew from the looks on everybody's faces who had to deal with that was not going to be the most popular decision. They're like, and because they're like, you can't light a black dragon, you won't be able to see him. And they're like, well, you kind of see him, when the light hits him and stuff like that. Yeah. So he's not 100% black. He's very, very, very dark gray.
Oh, that's interesting.
He also has a very slight modeling pattern on him, like almost a slight camouflage. So he has variance and stuff. So he's not just flat and boring looking. Yeah. So,
wow.
but and here's the last part of this story I'll tell. To their credit, the crew at DreamWorks had been working on this movie for well over a year. They had sets built, they had characters built, they had scenes that they had animated, and we brought them all into the auditorium, into the theater. And Dean and I very carefully stepped them through the new version of the movie. And we told them what we were doing and why we were doing it. And the last thing we laid on them was, and we're changing Toothless. We're going to need a new design. And I remember the absolute silence in that theater, because this was pretty heavy, what we were laying on them. To their credit, no one freaked out, no one objected. Everybody was on board. They were just processing it, all this new information. And they turned right around, and they built in just a couple of months what normally took them a year, because we had to turn that new Toothless design around from concept to being fully animated in just like a month or two. And again, they normally take about a year to go through this whole thing. So they really did a great job quickly building that dragon and getting him airworthy.
That's remarkable.
One of the last things we had to finally like tell the author, like we had to do the same. Or we like had to get on the phone and just go, here's the deal. We're changing Toothless. We explained again. We explained why. And from what I remember, she told her kids, and her kids were like, "No, he's cool. This is cool. We like the new one, right?" So they gave it their approval.
Oh,
she was great. Like, she was really, really great.
That's awesome.
She was on board with all the changes, and she totally understood. Like, she got it. Like, I know the book's one thing, the movie's another. I get it.
Yeah. That's one thing that's so interesting when you read about people who really understand screenwriting. They tell you that screenwriting is a whole new beast. You're rewriting the story pretty much because you're taking something that's maybe this long or this long, and you're making it
Mhm.
much shorter and streamlined and no fat on it. What I wanted like to know is how are you so because you had to go in front of the author and then the whole crew who'd been working on this.
Yeah.
How did were you able to be confident about the direction that you and Dean had chosen?
Um, if you worked in story a while, as you know, you can tell when something that like lines up, and
Yeah,
it felt like roller coaster track. Like the form looked good, and there's certain things like, well, if you have two situations and you can find like, it's like you have two situations, one of them has more conflict, that's the one you want to go with, because conflict is what movies are about.
yeah,
Conflict resolution. These are energy sources,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And movie making is extremely disciplined.
Yes.
If you can make it look like fun, good. Um, but the time limit keeps you honest. Like after you're over like 90 minutes, you're into a zone where you better have like an incredibly engaging movie if you're going to start crawling past 90 minutes.
You better be
Uh,
really good. Yeah.
yeah, you've got to have people engaged and stuff. So, I mean, I sit down all the time with a film that's like 2 hours long, and you're like, okay, by the end of the weekend, we have to have this down to like 95 minutes. So you've got like chunks. You got to take whole like entire sequences out of these films to get them to work. And then so many times you're like, oh my gosh, but I love this thing. I love this thing. And then you rip it out and you watch the movie without it, and you're like, no, it's better.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
hate it, but I like the movie better.
So you were able to be more confident because it felt whole. You felt like the conflict was bigger and better, and the dynamics were working. Is that
Absolutely.
okay?
Yeah.
Yeah,
A kid who's hiding this secret that he has a dragon friend from a dad who's bent on killing dragons. It's
yeah,
very different than the first reel, the first story reel,
yeah. I bet. Absolutely.
where it was again, it was more confusing. Like, is he hiding him? Does he like him? Does he not like him? What? And you come out of it and you're like, well, I don't really know what the situation with these dragons are. There's a
Yeah,
there's a chapter in the book that, again, it's easy to see how this stuff can happen, because there's a chapter in the book where the Viking teenagers go into a cave to retrieve dragon eggs, and the cave is full of like sort of glowing worms, and it's all gooey and sticky. Visually, it's really interesting.
yeah,
It's easy to see why you're like, oh man, I want to be the first person to board the sequence. It sounds amazing, right? You board it, and then you're forced to admit like it really doesn't even belong in the film. That happened to be way back on Beauty and the Beast.
yeah,
I worked on those sequences, and this is one of those moments of learning.
yeah.
Um, in the movie, we had this what looked like a really amazing sequence. Everything in this castle is alive. And despite Belle having promised that she's going to stay, she actually says, promise or no promise, I'm getting out of here. And she decides to run away. So I was in charge of boarding the sequence where, like, oh, a girl in a castle where everything is alive must get out without, sounding the alarm. So she's stepping over footstools and trying to open the wardrobe really quietly, and even the candelabras can come to life and stuff. And I did this whole sequence where she escaped. And I came in really early that morning to practice the pitch. And I had 3 storyboards worth of drawings. And I was practicing it. Bernie Mattinson came in even before Joe had come in, and he was sipping his coffee. And I said, oh, hey, Bernie, can I pitch this to you to practice? He said, sure. And I did. And I started at the upper left of the first board, and I pitched and I pitched and I pitched and I pitched the whole thing. And each board had about 55 drawings. And so I went through the first board, the second board, and the third board. And at the end of the third board, she rode away from the castle. And Bernie just sat there and he goes, just real quietly. And then he said, do you mind if I make a suggestion? And I said, no, please. And he said, I think you could cut from here. And he pointed to like the third drawing.
Yeah.
And then he went to, and he just kept walking past the first board, past the second board. At the end of the third board, he basically pointed to the last drawing and said, to here. And I thought, he's right. So basically, this sequence is unnecessary. You can
Yeah.
cut from the first drawing to the last drawing and put those together. And there you go. And by the time the rest of the crew and the directors and the producer had come in, I had realized, oh my God, he's absolutely right. So I tried with as much enthusiasm as I could muster. I pitched the board with all this enthusiasm. And at the end, I said, however, I think you could cut from here to here, as Bernie has pointed out. And everybody was like, oh yeah. And so it was like, so now in the movie, she says, promise or no promise, I'm leaving. And then you cut
And then
and
she's gone.
cut to the outside of the castle and she's riding out because nobody wants to deal with that.
Nobody cares how she got there. That's awesome. That is
But
really
that was like,
cool.
you know what? That was one of my first experiences in just how I think how cold you have to be sometimes, like, and how brutal. Like, I don't care if you boarded it. I don't care if you filmed it. Um, it doesn't belong in the film.
That's awesome. So here's an interesting question for you, and this is more on dynamics within the industry. So I have a project that has been considered at multiple places, and from the beginning, I've known that it would probably be wise to be a co-director on it. You know, like because I don't have my name isn't attached to any huge projects yet, right? And so generally, the industry wants a director who is, you know, this person directed that project, so they're marketable, right? And I noticed that you went from writing on Mulan to directing on Lilo and Stitch, and so I was wondering um, what the best way to navigate a situation like that would be. If possibly, even if on this project, like, I can't be the director, I'll just be the created by and the writer. You know, what's the best way to navigate a situation like that to like hone the opportunity to be a stepping stone to directing, but also, you know, making sure that you do a good job in that opportunity.
I think the key in this industry is, show up, do a great
Mhm.
job, don't be a problem, as in like be I have worked with story artists that I have not worked with very long,
Mhm.
because what I was really lucky. I'm going to back up just one second. I was really, really fortunate. Beauty and the Beast was the greatest experience, I think, along with Mulan,
Yeah.
for reasons. I learned a
Yeah.
lot on, but one of the things I learned on Beauty and the Beast is a great story crew. Um, you are devoted to a story and you're devoted to getting that story done. Nobody is going to go, nobody's going to throw a fit and run out of the room if they
Yeah.
don't get their way.
Yeah.
That's not, you have to work together and find problems and find ways to flow around problems. And artists like story artists like Joe Ranft just taught me so many incredible lessons. Joe Ranft and Ed Gombert, about resilience. And
Hmm.
like, I mean, you can have days where you feel like you've lost. You can
Oh
feel like
yeah.
the whole world is just collapsing around you
Been
because
there.
you
Yeah.
can't get this story to work, and you get stuck. And their ability to regroup and drive around a problem instead of
Hmm.
like just hitting a wall over and over until it breaks. Like, no, just now
Yeah.
you got to move around it. That's not going to move. So just that kind of adaptable, positive. It doesn't mean that you can't be passionate about your ideas,
Yeah.
but you've got to have ways of persuading people that this is a good idea. And if it's not a good idea, you yourself have to be accepting that it isn't. Move
Yeah.
on, change your idea. Like, I've ordered a whole sequence in Beauty and the Beast. It was an utter waste of time. And instead of throwing a fit, I was like, you're right, let's move on. So be the person that they can rely on. Be
Yeah.
positive, be inventive, and they'll always come back and go, hey, that guy was really, really great. Let's work with him again.
Yeah.
So just, I guess, be the person people want to work with. Be that
It's
person that
amazing
inspires
advice.
them, the person they
Yep.
want to work with. And that's really the only way to do this kind of thing, is that you build upon the things you've done. It's like, oh, you delivered this because you stuck with it, because you didn't give up. The hardest
Yeah.
project I ever worked on was Mulan.
Yeah.
That was a 6 year monumental undertaking for us.
Wow.
And most of my stories go back to Mulan. It was a very, very difficult film to get made. I did battle with writers. I battled with writers. I battled with some of the with the songwriter. I But I never left that movie's side. I always advocated for the movie. I battled for the movie. And I did make waves here and there. Like, and there were times where I felt like the movie was getting away from me. And I went through a very bad period of time where at the Florida studio, I was practically sleeping at the studio,
Yeah.
because I would work through the day. Then I would do my own work at night. I would go home just long enough to shower and get a few hours sleep, and I'd come right back, and I'd be back at the studio before anybody came in. So I'd be there until people left, and I'd come back in before they came in. So I was just always at the studio. But
Wow.
that was a period of time where I felt like I had invested years of my life. I'm not going to lose this now.
Yeah.
Not in the last 3 months. I'm not going to lose it now. And so
Wow.
yeah, that was a tough movie. And Lilo and Stitch owes a lot, owes many, many things to that film.
That
I
makes
wouldn't have had
sense.
the opportunity because after I finished that film, the president of the studio, who was Tom Schumacher, was impressed enough with what I had done that we had dinner at the very, very end. He came out to Florida. We were having dinner, and he said, "Is there anything you want to do? Is there anything you want to pitch?"
Oh.
And that's where I was like, there is something. And I remembered the story I'd worked on a long time ago. And I thought maybe I could pitch that. So that was the beginning of it. Was it
Wow.
so it earned the credibility on Mulan to helm my own project.
Yeah. Well, that sounds exactly like what I'd want to happen, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it was funny because I tell people like, wait, you don't want to be the director, and I'm like, there's lots to learn here. Like, you know, I have a lot to learn. I have directed on a series. I helped a studio get a series off the ground, and then I was developing a new series. And the what you're describing with Mulan was very much my situation there, where you know, and honestly, that I don't even know if that series is going to come to light. It may,
Mm.
but it was a challenging experience, and I had to remain devoted to the project, but also to the powers that be that that were making the project happen. And this is very interesting. All the things you learn from that.
Yes, a lot of times you are managing I think as a director, you manage anxiety on the part of the studio.
Yeah,
Um, and for good reason. They have a lot riding on these things. So you're a lot of your job is managing anxiety and
yeah,
letting them know they're heard, letting them also know that you have a steady hand on what you're doing. And
hmm,
as you know, when I made the transition from storyboarding and writing into directing, um, there came a moment like early on that I thought, well, I don't know if I can do this because I don't really know. I learned animation back in college, but I'm not an animator. I
yeah,
hadn't done that since college. So I'm not an animator. I'm not a layout person. I'm not a composer. I'm not a cameraman. How can I do this directing thing?
yeah,
Um, and there was this moment of like, but as you know, all you're doing as a director is you're attending to the story. So that was what I realized is my angle. I thought, I'm not going to tell people how to do their job. I don't have to know how to animate, nor do I have to know how to work the camera systems or do layouts or write music.
hmm,
I don't need to know those things. I know the story. And so whenever I would sit down, and Dean did the same thing, we came to this decision together. If we sat down with animators, we wouldn't tell them how to animate. We would tell them what the scene was about. And we made the decision as directors, if they animate something and it is different than the way we saw it in our heads, but if it works,
hmm.
we're done.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
they don't have to do the scene the way I saw it.
Hmm.
But if we check the box and like the moment worked, we're done.
Yeah,
And that allows people room to be creative and to bring their gifts to the party.
yeah,
And some other people. Because I definitely have known about directors that have gone, no, I want his ear to move like this, and I want his nose to move like this, and no, like this is the way I saw. So it puts the animators in a position where they're trying to second guess what is in somebody else's head, and that's just no way to go forward. You're not going to get things done. So
yeah.
um,
Well, that's the thing. You have a
you,
bunch
you
of
attend a story.
people working on this movie, and you want them to feel like they're adding something to it, that they're bringing something inspiring to it, that it's their passion project too.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes. So it's just you're going this direction. So when you know where the story is supposed to go, you can sit down with a composer even or like a layout person. It's like, okay, this moment of the film is about this. This is what the film needs. So and it's easier to advocate for the film than it is for yourself. It's
yeah,
weird. I could go in and fight for a film because I'm like, no, the film needs this, and I can fight for something or persuade people or stick with something. I'm not going to go in and go, well, I want this. It's like,
yeah.
no, the film is right. I know what the film is. Anyway, Yeah, when you advocate for the film and when you focus on the story, it doesn't matter who you're sitting in front of because you're just talking about the story, and then they can talk about, okay, to get this moment, we want it to be raining and dark and violets and blues and bruised purples and stuff, and you're like, yeah, that's it, that's what we need.
Yeah. My last question is usually, and I think we've already covered this a little bit, is if my goal is to get the greatest clarity of truth into a story, what approach would you recommend?
I tend to start at the end.
Yeah.
I tend to start at the
Yeah.
end because I think, like with Charlie Brown Christmas, or To Kill a Mockingbird, like I'm sure they thought, well, how do they want the audience to feel? And what is the primary thing you want to say? This is the interesting thing. Many times in animation, many times people go, but what is the theme? And they want a thematic statement before they're going to agree to make a film, which I think is kind of silly because,
Yes,
like,
it is.
well, I don't know, what was the theme of Raiders of the Lost Ark? Like, it has a story. I'm not sure it has a theme. The theme is always believe in yourself. I don't know. It's always the same thing.
Yeah.
But does it have a story? And in that story, so I want to talk story, but I also want to talk compelling. It doesn't have to be relatable. It's great if people relate, but I don't have to relate to any single thing in a Star Wars film to be captivated by it and to be compelled. I don't live in the future. I may not be, I'm not a Jedi. I don't have any of these people's problems. So this whole thing about like people need to see themselves and stuff like that, that's great. Absolutely. Inclusivity, fantastic. Absolutely. But in the actual machinations of the story, compelling is the most important. Because I can be compelled by stories that have people in them that don't look like me, that don't live where I live. But if I'm, and I'm even, but I'm compelled because I love those characters. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
And that's why you can, I think it's important to, like pay attention to the story. Don't worry too much about relatability. Yes, open it up, be inclusive. Here's the thing, don't work to exclude. That's the thing that we always do in it.
Yeah.
People say, well, how can you make a film for as many people as possible? I work to not exclude. If I try to have a film and a story that's working on many levels for different ages, for anybody who might come in. So I start at the end. I think about what do I want people to feel? What do I want to say? And then I back up from there.
Yeah.
And I make sure that I want to know where I'm landing before I jump.
Yeah. That's cool.
Because I think, if you start at the beginning and just try to work your way through things, you might go somewhere you didn't really want to go.
Yeah. I liked your statement on theme too. That was really cool. Like Miyazaki, as I was reading one of his books, he was talking about, well, if we could just write the theme down, then why don't you just do that? Why make an hour-and-a-half movie? There should be a lot more depth if we're going to go for an hour and a half. Something that's a lot more compelling, like you said. Yeah, that's really, really cool.
Yeah. And again, if you have a theme, great. That's great. Like, but people don't come to films and go, oh my gosh, I loved that theme. Nobody says that. Like,
no. I love the part when, or I was moved when, or, yeah.
Yeah. Theme versus story. I think it's almost a go-to sometimes. Like, well, what's your theme? Like, oh yeah. Well, if you think you have a movie, then what's your theme? Answer that. I can't tell you how many like great movies I've worked on that I couldn't tell you what the theme is. I don't know.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Will, this has been a wonderful time. Thank you so much for being on. And I've let people know where they can follow you on Instagram, on your link tree. I put that in the show notes so they can find that. And is there anything else you'd like people to check out in the meantime?
Oh my gosh, nothing I can think of.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you again for being on here, and until next time, I hope we all get a little wiser. Thank you for watching the Directing Animation Livecast, hosted by Scott Weiser, audio version edited by Kira Horowitz, copyright Scott Weiser LLC 2022. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and ring that notification bell.